Right now, without thinking, you are doing something your great-grandparents never did. You are filling a gap. Maybe you picked up your phone while the kettle boiled. Maybe you opened this video because there was a moment, just a moment, where nothing was happening, and your hand moved before your brain did. That reflex, that automatic reach for stimulation, the instant silence appears. Your grandparents didn't have it. Your parents barely had it. And the generation being born right now will never know what it felt like to not have it. We are the last humans in history who will ever experience boredom, the way boredom was meant to be experienced. And what we are losing is far more important than anyone is telling you. First, let's establish something that sounds obvious, but isn't. Boredom is not the absence of stimulation. That's what most people assume, that boredom is simply a gap, an empty space where something interesting should be. A problem waiting to be solved by the next notification, the next video, the next scroll. But that is not what boredom is. Not scientifically, not neurologically. In 2014, psychologist Sandi Mann at the University of Central Lancashire published one of the most counterintuitive findings in modern psychology. She took two groups of people. She gave the first group a boring task, copying numbers from a phone book by hand for an extended period. She gave the second group nothing to do at all. Just sit. Then she gave both groups a creativity test. The group that had done the boring task significantly outperformed the control group. They generated more ideas. They made more unusual connections. They explored more unconventional solutions. Mann's conclusion was not what the field expected. Boredom, she argued, is not a malfunction. It is a feature. When your brain is understimulated, it does not shut down. It shifts modes. It begins to wander. And wandering, it turns out, is where some of the most important thinking a human being ever does actually happens. But here is what nobody asked. What happens to a species that engineers wandering out of existence? To understand what we are losing, you have to understand what boredom actually built. For the overwhelming majority of human history, boredom was unavoidable. There was no content. There was no feed. There was no queue of things waiting to claim your attention the moment your current task ended. A farmer in 14th century England finished his work and sat. A sailor crossing the Atlantic in 1650 stared at water for weeks. A child in rural America in 1920 lay in a field and watched clouds for an hour because there was genuinely nothing else to do. This was not suffering. This was the default human condition. And inside that condition, something happened that we are only now beginning to measure and understand. Neuroscientists call it the default mode network, the DMN. It is a set of brain regions, the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate, the angular gyrus, that activate not when you are focused on a task, but when you are doing nothing in particular. For a long time, neuroscientists assumed the default mode network was simply the brain idling, background noise, a screensaver running, while the real work was paused. They were wrong. In 2001, neurologist Marcus Raichle at Washington University published research showing that the DMN consumes enormous metabolic resources. It is one of the most energy-intensive states the brain enters. It is not idling. It is working harder than almost anything else the brain does. The default mode network is where you process your past experiences and extract meaning from them. It is where you simulate future scenarios and rehearse how you might handle them. It is where you build your theory of other people's minds, your capacity for empathy, for understanding motivations, for modeling how someone else sees the world. It is where your sense of self is maintained and updated. It is, in the most literal neurological sense, where you become more fully yourself. And it only activates when you are doing nothing, when you are bored. Here is the part that should concern you. The default mode network does not activate when you are scrolling. This surprised researchers when they first tested it. Scrolling feels passive. It feels like nothing. It feels almost like rest. But your brain does not experience it as rest. It experiences it as low-grade stimulation, just enough input to suppress the default mode network without providing the depth of engagement that actually satisfies it. Neuroscientist Helen Immordino-Yang at the University of Southern California has spent years studying what happens to adolescent brains that are chronically deprived of inward focus. Her findings are stark. Without regular access to the default mode network, young people show measurable reductions in empathy. They struggle to construct coherent personal narratives, the internal story of who they are and where they are going. They have difficulty processing complex moral questions, not because they lack intelligence, but because the neural machinery required for that kind of thinking is going unused. Muscle atrophies when it isn't used. So does the default mode network. And here is the timeline that makes this urgent. The smartphone became standard in the developed world around 2012. The generation born after 2010, what researchers call Generation Alpha, has grown up with on-demand stimulation available from the moment they could hold a screen. Psychologist Jean Twenge at San Diego State University has tracked the mental health data of American teenagers across 4 decades. The decline she documents beginning in 2012 is not gradual. It is a cliff. Rates of loneliness, anxiety, depression, and identity confusion did not drift upward. They lurched. And Twenge is careful about causation. She is not simply blaming phones. What she is documenting is what happens when an entire generation grows up without the psychological experience of having nothing to do, without the enforced downtime that every prior generation in human history had no choice but to endure, without boredom. But there is something even more specific being lost, something that researchers have only recently been able to name. In 2017, psychologist Jonathan Smallwood at Queen's University published a study on what he called spontaneous thought, the kind of thinking that only emerges when the mind is left alone long enough to go somewhere unexpected. Smallwood found that spontaneous thought is not random. It follows hidden patterns. It connects experiences that conscious directed thinking would never link. It generates ideas that feel like they arrived from nowhere, because in a sense, they did. They arrived from a part of your mind that only opens when no one is demanding anything from it. Scientists call these moments insight experiences, the shower thought, the half-dream idea, the answer that appears on a walk after you stop trying to find it. Every major creative tradition in human history has known about this. Archimedes in the bath, Newton under the tree, Edison napping in a chair with a ball bearing in his hand, so that the moment he fell asleep and his muscles relaxed, the ball would drop, hit the floor, wake him, and he could capture whatever his drifting mind had just produced. These were not accidents. These were people who understood, intuitively, that the mind produces its most original work in the space between tasks. That space is vanishing, not slowly, not gradually, in a single generation. There is a word in German that has no direct English equivalent, Muße. It translates roughly as leisured contemplation, a quality of time that is neither work nor entertainment, not productive and not passive, simply open. Medieval scholars considered musa essential to wisdom, not optional, not a luxury, a prerequisite. You could not think deeply, they argued, without time that belonged to no one, time that made no demands, time that simply waited for your mind to wander into it. The ancient Greeks had a version of this. The Romans did. Almost every civilization that produced enduring philosophy, art, or science had a cultural framework that protected empty time as something sacred. We have dismantled that framework in roughly 15 years, and we have replaced it with something that feels like freedom, infinite choice, infinite content, infinite stimulation, but functions more like a closed loop. A closed loop that never lets your mind reach the end of a thought before offering it another one. Psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who spent his career studying creativity and optimal human experience, made a distinction that is worth sitting with. He argued that pleasure and enjoyment are not the same thing. Pleasure is passive. It arrives when conditions are favorable. Enjoyment requires engagement, challenge, the expenditure of mental effort towards something that matters. Scrolling produces pleasure. It almost never produces enjoyment, and it almost never produces what happens in the mind of a person with nothing to do, which is, when you follow the neuroscience to its end, one of the most sophisticated cognitive states the human brain is capable of entering. We handed that to children and told them it was boring. We gave them the alternative and told them it was better. Here's a particular kind of afternoon that most people over 30 can still remember. Summer. No plans, no device demanding your attention. The specific, almost physical sensation of time stretching out in every direction with nothing required of you. And at first, it was uncomfortable. The fidgeting, the vague restlessness, the sense that you should be doing something. And then, if you waited long enough, something shifted. Your mind went somewhere it chose to go. It found something. A thought, an idea, a feeling about your own life that had been waiting for exactly this kind of silence to surface. That experience has a neuroscience now. We know what was happening in your brain. We know what it was building and repairing and creating. We also know that it requires something the modern world has made almost impossible to access. Nothing. Just nothing. For long enough that your brain stops waiting to be entertained and starts doing what it evolved to do when left alone. The generation being born now may never wait long enough. They may never know the restlessness. They may never push through it. They may never reach the other side of boredom, where the interesting part lives. Not because they are weaker than the generations before them, but because no one will ever let them be bored long enough to find out. We built a world with no empty spaces, and we called it progress.